So, submarines. This video, this particular topic, I have started and recorded somewhere in the region of 9 times. I first wrote a version of this back in December last year. And it's changed. It's grown. It's a lot bigger than the original one. The original one was 12 slides. This is somewhere in the region of 23. The largest was 31. So it's going to be a long video, which is why I'm starting off this way, because I'm giving you a heads up. It's going to be a long video. I'm going to divide it into parts using the section headings, but it is going to be a long video. And really it's a long video of potential. You see, nothing has caused more fear. Nothing has caused more sensational headlines. And nothing has caused more potential to be claimed than submarines. They certainly have a lot of capability. They certainly are really something which is very interesting, because the whole point about the sea, usually in naval warfare terms, has been you can't hide. Oh yeah, you can put up you can have a fog bank in history, or a smoke screen more recently, but you can't really hide in daylight. Night is the big equalizer, but daylight you can see a long way, because it's only the curvature of the Earth which is your limitation on your horizon. But of course the sea is a dichotomy, because it has the surface, where traditionally naval warfare has taken place, and what's underneath, what keeps everything floating. And submarines turn naval warfare into this game of hide and seek by going down in the layers under the water. And specifically, going between the thermal incline layer is usually a very good thing. Ducking below and above that. If the enemy is focusing their sonar searching below, you might want to rise above, and that's so you can be actually above where they're focusing their search, or vice versa. Submarine warfare is why naval warfare involves 2 separate games of 3D chess. Because think about it, a ship can move, well, whilst it might rock from side to side and move on, you know, that axis, and while moving like that, and also be turning and going in a direction, so it's, you know, it's got a lot of different forces on it in movement. It's all moving on the surface of the sea or the river. Aircraft can go up, down, fly all around. Submarines can go up, down, fly around. And then you have the poor ships in the middle, the surface. Well, that's a traditional thing. There are going to be 2 videos like this year, because there's also going to be another video on air power and the destruction of ships. And that is a lot more complicated than we often see in the narrative. All of history has a narrative. Okay? And that is fine. The narrative is often, broadly speaking, correct. However, once you get into the context, the nuance, suddenly the fact that a lot of people didn't agree, or lots of decisions seem to fly in the face of that narrative, start to make sense. Submarines have all this theoretical capability, but it's actually building a submarine that actually can live up to that capability is difficult. And even more so, it's building up a submarine which can live up to that level of difficulty in the face of what's being developed on the other side to counter it. Because submarines do not exist in a vacuum. Vessels like this, all three of these class of destroyers, hunted submarines. It's one of the quirks of histories. Travel class destroyers are general purpose destroyers, yet they hunted submarines just as often as other destroyers. In fact, they did quite well versus them. There's also there's a confirmation bias in our understanding of submarines. We report, and use reports when they're successful. The stats you see when you're talking about World War II, when you're talking about World War One, is the ships they've sunk. That is never arrayed next to the ships they failed to sink. That's never arrayed next to the ships they missed. Sometimes it's compared against the number of submarines sunk. But that's the two easy ones to quantify because you have fixed points of reference. Things you can prove. Information you can readily prove. This ship was sunk on this date by mine or torpedo. So therefore it's attributed to this submarine. We can work through the data. This submarine was sunk on this date at this time. We can work through the data. This submarine reports it launched a torpedo at this point. No ship was reported sunk. Okay. We can start to assess that data. This submarine reports it sees a convoy in the distance. It cannot maneuver to intercept. Which convoy? Are we sure? Because honestly, how far can they see? Was it on the surface at the time? Was it on... Was it, using its periscope? This submarine, even though it was right next to where the convoy went, never saw the convoy because 20 minutes, 30 minutes earlier, before they came within visual range, it got dived on by a swordfish and it went underwater and hid. How do you report that? How do you quantify that? You don't... That... News flash. Submarine hid from aircraft. You didn't sing it, did you? You can hear the response. Well, yeah, but I achieved a mission kill because it stopped them attacking the convoy. Yeah, but you didn't sink it. We record when submarines are successful. And to talk again a little bit about sort of the other video I talked about, just going like this, we record when aircraft are successful. We talk about the sinkings of battleships by aircraft. Pearl Harbor, Taranto. They're both in harbour, they're not manoeuvring. In the nicest way, the Royal Navy has the world's crack specialist aircraft and doesn't have enough of them in there because it planned a multi-carrier attack and the other carrier was damaged and not working because it had already lost 2 carriers in the war so far and was so short of aircraft carriers by the point it was launching it. Pearl Harbor, where it's a tragedy for the ships hit, But honestly, when you look at the sheer amount of effort expended and the sheer amount of force they go in, honestly, you'd expect them to achieve more. And then we talk about Repulse and the Prince of Wales. Yeah, they're on their own. Bismarck. Damaged by torpedoes from aircraft on its own. Yamato. On its own. Oh, so that proves battleships are sunk by aircraft. Ship on own gets overwhelmed. Ship on own, cruisers on their own got overwhelmed by torpedo boats. Ships on their own got overwhelmed by smaller vessels. Knights on their own could get overwhelmed by outlaws. Regularly in history. The whole itinerant knights, travelling from joust to joust. Well, the idea they used to travel around solo is kind of silly because as a rule they used to travel around with their mates in groups. For tourneys and events. Why? Because there were dangerous people on the road, and no matter how well trained and how well armoured you are, if you're on your own, and there are lots of them, they might only be armed with bows and spears, but they will probably win. Yet, look at the Mediterranean convoys, where you have battleships as part of the task groups pushing through the convoys. Yes, they get damaged. Some of them move a lot slower than Yamato does, but they don't get sunk. They get damaged. An Italian battleship gets its entire rear blown off by a brand new air-to-surface glide bomb more than anything. And that's powerful. That's a statement, but is that really proof that the aircraft are the ultimate determiner and have overpowered the battleship? Or have they proved that they are the new small fry, that if you're alone they can take you out? And so now you have to start moving in packs. Submarines have a similar scenario. We had a Turtle in 1776 launching its attack. Would you really want to operate that? And considering how relatively simple its construction is and how relatively, well, how do I put this politely, potentially successful it could have been, the fact is, it doesn't get used. The attack on Eagle, Admiral Richard Howe's flagship, is a thing of ingenuity, if not really successful. Nautilus. Well, that's a submarine designed by Robert Fulton, and It's an interesting capability. It's an interesting idea. It's the same with the Brandtusche. The Brandtusche is the oldest known surviving submarine in the world. It's this one. It's worthwhile going and seeing if you can. It has an interesting history. Propelled by a crew of 3 turning large tread wheels connecting to a propeller. The boat could reach a speed of 3 knots. Unsurprisingly, that couldn't be maintained for long periods of time. And then we have a very interesting vessel. This is one you're probably not that familiar with, but you can find its hull in Panama's Pearl Islands, and that is the Submarine Explorer. Built between 1863 and 1866 by Julius H. Kroll and Ariel Patterson in Brooklyn, New York, for the Pacific Pearl Company. It was supposed to assist with pearls. But, yeah. Submarine Explorer is his name. And then we have the Hunley, which is the first successful attack. It just costs the life of the crew and the submarine in the process. The Hunley was, of course, found recently, and they're still examining it and still trying to work out some of the details of it, but it was actually lost twice. Before it was used to attack the Houston Anik. It was lost on the 29th of August 1863, where 3 crew escaped, 5 died, including a Michael Caine, Nicholas Davis, Frank Doyle, and John Kelly and Absalom Williams. It had been lost on the 15th of October 1863, with Horace Hunley himself, the designer, Thomas S. Parks, Henry Beard, Rob Brookbanks, John Marshall, Charles McHugh, Joseph Patterson, and Charles O. Spragg. Originally intended to attack by using a floating explosive charge with a contact fuse, which was what a torpedo was in 19th century's terminology, broadly speaking. Instead, they decided to try a spar torpedo. Houston Anik, 1,260-ton, wooden-hulled, steam-powered sloop of war. Seems a bit much, but that's what technically it's called. Armed with 12 guns, was sitting at the entrance to Charleston, so it wasn't manoeuvring, was just anchored 5 miles offshore. Lieutenant George Dixon and a crew of 7 volunteers rammed the Hunley's spar torpedo against the enemy's hull. The torpedo was detonated. sent Hustanik to the bottom in 5 minutes, along with 5 of her crewmen. And the sunken Hunley was found on the seaward side of the sloop. So, we're not sure really what happened. There are various ideas for what might have happened, but it's the definition of a Pyrrhic victory, because you lose the vessel which gives you the victory, you lose all 8 crew, and whilst you do take down a ship with 12 guns, let's be honest, the US Navy had a lot of them at the time, and they'd only lost 5 crew, so... But it's got potential. And the thing is, submarines' potential has kept growing. We've had the plongeur, which was French for diver. It's this one, by the way. In 1859, the Conseil del Travail called naval engineers for designs for a submarine. They chose that submitted by Simeon Bourgeois, later Admiral Simeon Bourgeois, and Charles Brun. Now, this is the first submarine to be propelled by mechanical rather than human power. That's important, because that's when submarines start to have a viability. Once you're using more power than human power. Because humans require a lot of oxygen, especially if they're working. Engines require oxygen as well, but humans require food, water, rest. Honestly, humans are annoying. Squidgy organic bits cause a lot of problems for engineers. Catering to their needs. You know they need to go to the toilet? It's terrible. There again, you can always avoid it and just make like most German submarines in World War I and II and stink them. You know, just use buckets. Have it just all around, making it stink. I can't think why they're not considered the most habitable places in the periods. Really. It's important once they start using engines. And yes, her compressed air engine, the air was contained in 23 tanks holding at roughly 180 psi, which took up 153 meters cubed, roughly. And this is what drove the submarine's size. The engine had a power of 60 kilowatts, or 80 horsepower, and could propel the submarine for 5 nautical miles at a speed of 4 knots. It also used compressed air to empty its ballast tanks. And the submarine was armed with a ram to break the holes in the hulls of enemy ships, and an electrically fired spar torpedo fixed at the end of the pole. Sounds... Let's be honest, it sounds positively frightening. Is there anything in that scenario which honestly sounds like a good vessel to use? See, the headlines are going, this is the future of naval warfare, this is danger, unprecedented threat. But anyone who's looking at the actual detail time will look at that ship and go, to itself? I mean, literally, it can do 5 nautical miles underwater. That's worrying, yes, but it runs on compressed air and it's got a good chance of blowing itself up. A spar torpedo is not a great idea. Oh, and its other plan is to ram. So, in other words, what it'll really do is stick in our side and we'll bring it home with us and then have to figure out how to get it off. Probably by going through the gates of a dry dock and again just knocking it off. Or, you know, or maybe sending some divers down. But then we're going to have to recover the bodies and the smell. Oh. Yeah. We haven't even got to the 20th century yet. Then we have Isatino. Isatino? Well, first air-independent and combustion-powered submarine, and the first submarine to overcome what is considered some of the fundamental problems of machine-powered underwater navigation. Launched in 1864. Now, this is one of the things, that's great, you know, you sort of go, wow, that's an amazing submarine. She has a coal-powered steam engine on the surface. She can do a top speed of 4.5 knots on the surface. Her test depth was 30 meters, and they were really not keen about going down that far. She managed to do a maximum of 7 hours submerged before La Navigation Submarina went bankrupt, having exhausted their funds, including 100,000 duros of Narcissus Montreal, which itself could at the time have purchased 160 kilograms of gold or several frigates. Unfortunately, what happened then was the creditor who was funding the whole thing called it in, who took then the only asset of the builder, Montreal, and it's the replica of it is the one at the top. And well, the creditor sold it to a businessman, which made it on a ship, not a research thing, which meant it had to be taxed, and rather than pay the tax, the businessman dismantled it. Now, next we have what was originally called the Serene, but then became called the Gustav Zelde, after its own creator. A naval architect who had died in 1891 following an explosion during development of an experimental torpedo. Now, both her and her smaller predecessor sister Guillemot were electrically propelled using power from storage batteries. And the whole point was they were part of the French attempts to try and face the numerically superior Royal Navy. But this thing had a speed of 9 knots on the surface, 6.5 knots submerged, and armament again was a single 14-inch fume short. Well, no. 2. It's going to sound strange. Right, so she has a 14-inch fume short torpedo sort of system, which sometimes works, sometimes doesn't work. And she then has 2 torpedoes in drop collars, which again are interesting things. And honestly, if you're the Royal Navy at the time, you could understand why someone might be moved to just call them ungentlemanly warfare, because it's nicer than saying you're going to kill your crews before you kill us. Now, I'm not saying the Royal Navy's not looking into this. The Royal Navy is also pushing into submarines, as are the US Navy and lots of other navies at this point. And, you know, they're all getting involved in them, and lots of navies are getting involved in it. But the numbers of submarines they're buying are teeny. They're 5 or 6 boats, and if you've got and you're talking in a world pre-computer simulation, all the other stuff, they're basically testing out the concept and trying to figure out, okay, so this sounds really good as an idea, abstract idea. We can move in the underwater sphere. But is it frigating possible? Well. Honestly, the first one where it starts to become, to an extent, possible, arguably possible, is the Naval, which has 4 450mm 70x7-inch torpedoes in 4 Dresky drop collars. So, well, at least it can fire 2 sets of torpedoes. That's got to be something good. But the thing that's interesting about her is she can do nearly 10 knots on the surface, 5.5 knots submerged, but she has a range of 345 nautical miles at 8.83 knots on the surface, or 58 nautical miles at nearly 3 knots submerged. It's starting to look good. Ordered 1898, laid down 1898, launched 1899, and commissioned in June 1900. She was powered by an Adolphi Siegel steam boiler and electric batteries. However, submarines start to come in, and anti-submarine warfare starts to come about. And the Russo-Japanese War of 1905 is a good example about what happens. Yes, we all hear about the Battle of Tsushima, but did you realize the Russians built the first submarine fleet? They sent them up together. They based them in Vladivostok. They weren't exactly that successful. And anti-submarine warfare in the Russo-Japanese War usually consisted of small boats catching a Russian submarine on the surface, because diving was not a quick process, and attacking them with quick-firing guns. The fact that most of the Somme class actually survived the war is nothing less than amazing. You know, the Somme herself, pictured, well, actually no, that's Beluga, which was one of the ones. A Somme herself, aka Catfish, was actually was one of the ones which were attacked, and she survived. I think the Japanese were having a bad day with the firing, honestly. It's an amazing thing they survive. And one of the things that people often come back to me and go, why were they so slow in developing anti-submarine weapons to attack them below the water? Because more often than not, they were catching the submarines on the surface. And again, there's confirmation bias. Oh, we've managed to attack them on the surface, so we will be able to attack them on the surface. And it's only as batteries and things actually start to improve from this point that it becomes more of a problem to find them and to attack them. And the problem with that, the problem with this whole scenario of them getting better at being underwater is they're still not very good at attacking anything from underwater. So yeah, they can now hide for longer. That's great. That's wonderful. They can hide for longer underwater. Which means they're more survivable in the face of enemy threats. But that also means they're not really any more lethal. On paper, it is an amazing capability from the get-go in potential. But the theme of this video, and something I'm going to keep returning to, probably often enough that you might get a little bit bored of it, is that potential doesn't equal actual capabilities. And the trouble is, whilst you have to develop those capabilities to try and develop it into a potential, from potential to an actual capability, you also have to build for the reality of the capabilities now. And I'm getting a lot of tings on MS Teams right now, so... Luckily, things started to get better. In the 1910s, we have boats regularly turning up, which actually look like what we see in the World War One. Actually look like it. The Royal Navy's D-class at the top are, from D6 onwards, the first class to be fitted with forward deck guns. They also, now, and there is a little dispute over exactly who thought of it first, who implemented it first, because some of the systems that were implemented weren't implemented successfully. So there's a case of, yes, we built a system into our boats which allows them to fire their torpedoes through tubes, but oh, when they do it, sinks the boat. So do you really classify that as successful implementation of technology? You know, it's a thing to think about. Do we consider that we give the boat which first goes to sea with a torpedo tube is the first torpedo tube submarine, or do we consider the fact that when it tries to use that tube, it sinks itself to be, no, you haven't quite got it, really, have you? You haven't. You shouldn't really have it. You can. That can go to another class. It's complicated. It's, well, if we consider, again, I keep using aviation because aviation and submarine warfare, those sort of, as I said, the bits above and below the surface that allow all the different movements and all different flexibilities that have come with them, they've developed in many ways in parallel. When we consider aircraft, we don't date the first jet landing as the first jet landing on a carrier, because the first one crashed. It was the American attempt. And so it didn't succeed. It's not considered... Yes, it landed, but it crashed. The British one landed and took off. And I would say, considering the difficulty of flying both aircraft involved, it's luck of the pilot. And, well, luck of the pilot. It's probably the best way to put it down to how that working out. Because if it's your first ever landing of a jet aircraft, no one's done it before, and how you handle it, especially at low power, is different. With submarines, periscope? The snorkel's years away. But torpedo tubes? Believe it or not, you can't just use the same ones you use on a ship. That caused a lot of fun. Because a ship, as a rule, the torpedo tubes mounted below water level were mounted on the side of the ship. Occasionally they've been mounted in the bow or the stern. All strong points. Torpedo tubes are mounted off-center. If you consider the D-class, they have 2 forward, 1 aft. Oh, when they carried 6 torpedoes. So they had reloads. A range of 2,500 nautical miles at 10 knots on the surface, or 45 nautical miles at 5 knots submerged. Their top speed, 14 knots on the surface, 10 knots designed, 9 knots with a good current submerged, more likely 8. But they are more like it. And then we have up here your German collection. And by the way, this is the point at which classes are starting to be built. Submarines are starting to be ordered in classes. We have the SMU-17 up there, which sank the first British merchant vessel in the First World War, sank 10 other ships, damaged another one, and captured 2 ships, survived the war without casualty. Okay, that's a very successful submarine. But also up there is SMU-19. SMU-19 became the first U-boat casualty of World War I. She was rammed by HMS Badger on 24th October 1914. Her hull was badly damaged, but she was survived and repaired. HMS Badger, of course, was an Acheron-class destroyer of the Royal Navy. And she goes on to have an interesting career. Her sister ship, SMU-20, is going to be discussed a lot in the next slide. And then we have the Archimedes. 1909 theoretically, but honestly, the French either managed to procure submarines brilliantly and quickly, or they take so long you sit there and go, what happened? Did you go on a lunch break one year and not come off it till next year? How? How? Now, she's interesting because she's capable of almost 15 knots on the surface and 11 knots submerged, and is actually capable of this. She weighed in at 580 tons on the surface, 809 tons submerged. However, she's French. And so this is going to explain the entirety of what I'm about to say. She carried one 450mm bow torpedo tube, 2 single 450mm Dresky drop collars, and 4 single external 450mm torpedo launchers. Yep. If you're thinking, Alex, that doesn't make sense. Well, the 2 single rotating Dresky drop collars were below the walking deck after the conning tower, and so they allowed her to sort of angle the fire. They had 2 fixed launching frames abreast the conning tower, aimed 10 degrees off the centre line. Another pair forward of the conning tower, aimed 6 degrees outwards. This theoretically gave it a maximum of the ability to fire a spread of 7 torpedoes forward. And the Dreskies sort of cover a bit of the aft, but honestly, the whole thing is a maintenance nightmare, and you can sort of understand her experience. When First World War began in August 1914, Archimedes was assigned to the 3rd Submarine Flotilla of the 2nd Light Squadron at Cherbourg. Their mission was to close the English Channel to German ships and protect the Entente ships in cooperation with the Royal Navy. Her and other submarine Marriott were ordered to Calais on 24 September, placed on the British command in preparation for Operation North Sea. She was transferred to the 2nd Submarine Flotilla on 19th October. And then she's then sent to Harwich, England, and placed under Keyes' command of the Harwich Force. After the British found out that the High Seas Fleet had sortied on 14th December, Keyes ordered 8 submarines, including Archimedes, to set a patrol line north of the neutral Dutch island of Terschelling, no later than the morning of the 16th December, to defend against any German attempt to enter the channel. Archimedes was paired with E-11, and a British submarine, successor to D-class, and they were stationed at the northern end of the patrol line. She did many, many such operations throughout World War One. She was a critical part of those operations. But she doesn't really have what you would call a successful career. And again, here is another thing when you have to consider submarine warfare. If the Germans had tried to cross that line and had been taken out by submarines, it rings in their defence and rings in their sort of status and capabilities. But the Germans don't, and so what do we have to judge them by? We can talk about the theory of what they could have done. Honestly, Archimedes sort of reminds me of an early attempt to get a T-class submarine as the British designed later in 1930s to sort of be an ambush predator and just fire a massive spread of torpedoes. Potentially, very viable. But also potentially, depending on the viability of the torpedoes, very problematic. Now this of course is what World War I is remembered for. The sinking of the Lusitania. And other ships, oh, they got hit by a torpedo. Well, here's the dirty little fact of World War One. We talk about Lusitania, we're talking about often SMU-20. It's the one which takes it. Ocean-going boat. Most of World War One, the vast majority of the victories, the vast majority of the kills, the vast majority of the damage done by the German Navy in World War II were done by the class at the top here. The German Type UC-2 submarines. They're mine-laying subs. In fact, the UC-2 is possibly the most successful submarine design in history. They sank more than 1,800 enemy vessels for a class of only 64. 46 of them will be lost in combat. They carried guns, 7 torpedoes and up to 18 mines. Double hulled. They're improved versions of the UC-1s. And why are they so good? Because the torpedoes mostly aren't that great, but mines are something which people have been working with for a long time. The Whitehead torpedo is still relatively new. Still getting its act together. But mines have been around for a long time. After all, originally torpedoes were mines. So, yeah, mines were good. Being able to lay 18 of them, it's great. You see a convoy coming, you lay some mines in front of them where you think they're going to be. You drop some mines off outside a port in a cleared route. You find a gap in an enemy minefield and you stick your own mines in it. So the enemy come rushing in thinking they're safe and go boom. Mines are absolutely frigging devastating at sea. And the UC2 exploited that. But they are not the most numerous vessel to serve the German Navy, the Kaiserliche Marine, in World War One. That's the UB-3 coastal submarines. Best subscribers. And in many ways they are a modified version of the UC. 2. UB-3s sank 521 ships for a total of 1,123,211 gross registered tons and 7 warships, including HMS Britannia, before the end of the hostilities. HMS Britannia, of course, being a very nice example of an Edward VII class pre-dreadnought. The Germans planned 201. They had 145 being built, and 96 were completed. 56 were cancelled, and 37 were lost. They are the submarines which do the killing, and these are the ones which provide the mass. So when people ask why, World War One, the Germans are actually more effective. They actually achieve more in many ways in their submarine warfare in World War One than they do in World War Two. They get far closer to winning. Well, partially it's the colonies, and the convoys, and the colonies and the convoys from the colonies. It's the case of it's the way the British are structuring things. In World War One, you do not have the level of infrastructure built up in the colonies that you will do in World War Two. The massive program of Flower class escorts, Flower class corvettes, which are built in World War II, are mostly built off the infrastructure which was first put in place for the Flower-class sloop program of World War I. So there is a differential to that going on. There's also the fact that the Germans were operating more in British coastal waters, so they knew where the convoys were having to go. The convoys are having to go to certain fixed places. They're going to ports. You can predict their route far more easily when you're predicting within distance of the port. Once you can push and project with hunter-killer groups, with aircraft patrols, which are developed during World War One, but they're not in service really to the end, you can push those submarines out from those areas of so close to your port, where they can use mines, where they can set up infantry minefields, where coastal submarines like this can hang around and dog your coastal convoys. Once you can push them slightly further away, you give yourself far more breathing space. And again, this is another thing which has to be remembered. One of the questions that comes in often are people who go, well, why did they not realise the submarine was quite so powerful after World War I? Because surely it had shown it was powerful. Yes, it had. But it also shown there were answers to it. There was the convoy system. There were necessities you needed to do. And then in the interwar year, Aztec comes along. It finally bears fruit. That's great. We now have something that allows us to detect enemy submarines below the water. And if you can detect it, you can kill it. Or at least drive it away. Because again, there is the difference. Stats and, to an extent, politicians and press want to hear you've killed an enemy submarine. And this goes back to what I was saying at the beginning. But that's not what you need to do. You need to get your convoy through. So that plane keeping that submarine down so it can't engage as the convoy goes past is a kill for you. It's a mission win. And that's what you need to do. You need to win the mission. You do it enough times, you've won the war. But it doesn't look good in the papers. So what happens after World War One? Do things just sit on their lonesome? Does everyone just go, well, we've now developed submarines, we don't need to do any more? No, thank Lord. Honestly, the submarines in World War One, they more often than not, they actually do manage to make it home. That's great. They're still not brilliant. So let's consider the O class. Oh no, they're beautiful. They're a class of 9 submarines. And they are procured for the Royal Australian Navy, but also transferred to the Royal Navy in 1931 because Australia is financially in issues. They're still good vessels. They now have an armament consisting of 8 torpedo tubes, 6 in the bow, 2 in the stern. That's this class, by the way. They have a single 4-inch gun. They're saddle tank type, which is why they have this sort of shaping. Fuel carried in riveted external tanks, which was fun because that proved to be vulnerable to leaking after depth charge damage, which therefore revealed their position. But the interesting thing about the O-class submarines is they are the first British submarines fitted with Aztec and very low frequency radio, VLF, which could be used at periscope depth. And why does that matter? Well, because once you are able to have reliable radio communications, and basically secure, reliable radio communications. Maybe secure, maybe not, but hopefully you code it, and hopefully you change your codes very regularly. Once you have reliable radio communications, you can start coordinating your submarines. And that's the cornerstone of what comes later in World War II, the coordination of submarines. Now, the KXI class, they're a good example of what's going to be built at this point, because they're built by Feyenoord in shipyard in Rotterdam for the Royal Netherlands Navy. They use for patrols in Dutch colonial waters. And they started their service at the beginning of World War II. They were all in service at the beginning of World War II. They were built between 1922 and 26. They had 2 21-inch bow torpedo tubes, 2 17.7-inch bow torpedo tubes, and 2 17.7-inch stern torpedo tubes. So again, someone was deciding to have a logistical nightmare. But, you know, of course, the 21-inch torpedo has more power. It's bigger, it's tougher, it's going to cause more damage. It's going to have longer range. Oh, lovely! But think about that from a logistical perspective. Okay, 21-inch torpedo tube racks are gonna be here very inefficient for storing a 17.7-inch torpedo tube or torpedo. But you won't be able to store a 21-inch torpedo on a 17.7-inch torpedo tube rack. Oh, this could be problematic. Plus, they carried an 88mm Bofors gun. Again, the 88mm produced by more countries than just Germany. One of them is actually scuttled, the K-13, to prevent her from being captured by the Japanese when she was under repair at Surabaya. But K-11 and K-12 served throughout World War II. Well, K-12 decommissioned May 1944, but K-11 makes it to April 1945. 1930s, finally, we have some submarines which, you can start really getting excited about, almost excited about the safety record of. And, you can start thinking of submarines as we think of them. And that's the thing. We often misunderestimate just how interesting service aboard a World War I boat was. Well, World War II boats are highly, highly evolved things in comparison. And you still wouldn't be enjoying a quality of life aboard it. I once remember a talk I went to it was part of a conference. How was that? British Commission for Military History's New Researchers Conference. And the young man who was talking on the panel before me was talking about submariners. And how many of them were chosen because they were alone in the world. Orphans, unmarried, no siblings. That was the group that was sort of encouraged. Why? Because, as we've already discussed when we were talking about the Hunley, early submarines have a habit of eating their own crews before they do any damage to the enemy. The porpoise class. They're interesting vessels, but frankly, for them, you are looking at the basis of Salmon, Sargo, Tambor, Gato, Ballo, and Tench classes. All start off with the porpoise class. They are this critical juncture in US Navy submarine design. Without them, I was looking at the picture on the screen there, and I just realised that makes me look weirdly off to that angle. So I'll move the picture. Without them, without these 10 boats, of which 4 are lost in World War II, the US Navy would have been sorely, sorely pressed. Now, they had been built originally with the idea of perhaps attaining the goal of having a 20 knot, the sort of dream of having a 21 knot fleet submarine. The idea being you'd have a submarine which could keep up with the standard type battleships. That was the dream the USN had. And you can understand where this dream comes from. Because imagine if you're refighting Jutland in the middle of the Pacific. But, what has happened to you, mate? Well, with our battle fleet, the thing is, it might only go 21 knots, but that has meant, thunder! Each one of the battleships here, 4 submarines are fanning out. We have the 21 knot fleet submarines. You ambush the ambush. You have more submarines at the critical battle. Yes, the enemy can maneuver faster, but their submarines can't keep up with the pace of the battle. There again, having a submarine on the surface doing 21 knots. They could do a high surface speed of 18 knots, so they were getting closer to it. From Perch onwards, they managed to increase their range. And we're doing 6,000 nautical miles to 11,000 nautical miles. So we're from 6,000 nautical miles to 11,000 nautical miles at 10 knots. Which is what allowed them to extend patrols in Japanese home waters. That's the critical thing. They could go a long, long way. But they could only do 8 knots submerged. And again, they have 6 21-inch torpedo tubes. If you're going to go for 21-inch, go for all 21-inch. 4 forward, 2 aft, and 16 torpedoes carried. A single 3-inch deck gun, 2 50 cal machine guns, and 4 30 cal machine guns. They are probably... without them, what happens later wouldn't have happened. Wouldn't have been able to happen. And then we have the British S-Class. Originally designed for the North Sea and Mediterranean Sea to replace the H-Class. They became the single largest group of submarines that have ever been built for the Royal Navy. A total of 62 were constructed over 15 years. 50 of them being considered the improved variant launched between 1940 and 45. Simply put, this was the boat which was the backbone for the Royal Navy. There are other classes which I will talk about, which are better than it. I would say the U-class is better than it, and the U-class is better than it in Mediterranean. They are. They're smaller. I would say the T-class is better for the Pacific, but they were designed to be. But, without a doubt, the S-Class were probably the best balanced capability for the North Sea. And that's their big problem. Because in the theatre where they are best suited and most critical, there is often least for them to do. There might be a few coastal convoys, but unless they catch Bismarck or something going out through the Denmark Straits, there's not really going to be much glory. But there's a lot of work they're going to have to do. They're critical to intelligence gathering throughout World War II. It's S-boats which are doing some of the dirtiest, nastiest, and most covert, i.e. secretive, operations off the coast of Germany in World War II. And Norway. They're essential. But also, due to their numbers, there are S-boat class boats turning up everywhere. Everywhere in the war effort. So now we started talking about the war. Let's move on to it. So, let's start off with World War II, and let's start off with the Atlantic theatre, because, let's be honest, that's sort of the biggie. The Battle of the Atlantic is massive. And when we say massive, on the Allied side, roughly 36,200 naval personnel are killed. Roughly 36,000 merchant naval personnel are killed. 3,500 merchant vessels are lost. 175 warships are lost. 741 RAF Coastal Command aircraft lost in anti-submarine sorties. That's a pretty big number, isn't it? On the German Axis side, 30,000 of the U-boat personnel are killed. 783 submarines are lost. 47 other warships are lost, including a battleship. 500 Italian sailors lose their lives, and 17 submarines lost by the Italians, totaling 800 submarines lost in the Battle Atlantic. Okay. Let's start thinking about that. That's a huge number. 3,500 merchant vessels destroyed. Lost. About 175 warships. 741 coastal air command aircraft lost in anti-submarine sorties, but there are many, many scenarios where they're lost, but it's unlikely they were shot down by submarines. That's going to be a minority. $800 submarines lost. In other words, the Battle Atlantic, the largest naval campaign waged by submarines ever. And yet, the submarines, which are these things which are quite so all-conquering in some historical perceptions, lose 4 times more submarines than surface warships. Okay, yes, you can argue the submarines' preferred target was not the warships. The submarines' preferred target was to go after the merchant vessels. And there's still a rather large number of naval personnel killed. But one of the things they're not listing there is the aircraft involved. And those personnel killed. It's a rather large campaign. And it is 175 warships. And on average, a warship does have a large crew than a submarine. The trouble for the Germans with the Battle Atlantic was ultimately the best weapons of World War One, as we've been over, were the submarines which were focusing and manoeuvring in the inshore coastal waters, and the mine-laying boats, because of the damage they could inflict. Interesting to note, the British were deathly afraid the Germans would try and repeat the same tactics from the mine-laying boats. And the fact the Germans didn't produce that many mine-laying submarines, in fact at several points the Royal Navy has more mine-laying submarines in the service than the German Navy does, was probably a blessing for the British. But it's also a reflection of the fact that Germans had changed tactics. Instead, you have a patrol line that's coordinated from home, with lots of information going backwards and forwards. You hunt down the convoys using condors and other long-range reconnaissance assets, and then you set the wolf packs upon them. These groups of submarines you organise. And you wear down the forces and keep wearing down the forces. So they have hours, days of constant attacks going on. It's absolutely brutal for the convoy court, but there is still a small problem. If the submarines really want to move fast, they have to move fast on the surface. And the other problem is the vast majority of submarines in the German fleet are not available in 1939. In fact, are not even really available in 1940. This large submarine arm, as it becomes, it's not really. There's actually a debate between whether it's the Italian or the Japanese who have the most submarines in the Axis alliance. And there are even some people who make a strong case, but it is a strong case because it is debatable, because it's depending on whether you're going by tonnage, number of boats, capabilities of boats, etc., over whether or not the Italians have the largest submarine fleet in the world at the beginning of World War II, not the Germans. And that's the big trouble for the Germans. By the time their submarines are really getting up to strength, the British have started to crack their communications code, getting them inside the operational control loop of information. But also, the British have got long-range aircraft coming into play and starting to search for submarines. They have got the Flower-class corvettes coming into service at a pace. The Hunt-class escort destroyers coming into service at a pace. All these things which they'd started off the design and planning for various points in the 1930s, they've been doing the research for them, but let's be honest, really started working on them in about 1937, had started doing the preparations and pulling together those plans in 1938, and ordered them all, laid them all down well before World War II began. Well, it's easier and quicker for the Royal Navy and the British maritime industry and the Commonwealth and the Commonwealth/colonial maritime industry to spur itself up than it is to German, because Germany's still rebuilding itself after Versailles. There is, though, a very interesting event which takes place. And this is towards the latter part of World War II. In fact, it's the 9th of February 1945. Off Fedje Island, Norway, U-boat U-864. This is HMS Adventurer. Watch sunk it. Is sunk. This remains the only time in naval history where a submarine has sunk another whilst they were submerged. U-864 was a Type 9 U-boat. One of these lovely long-range beasts. It was taking part in Operation Caesar, taking materials to Japan. And it passed through the Fedje area of Norwegian coast without being detected, but an engine kept misfiring. Various people put ideas around what might have caused this. But what is known is the British were getting the information and knew there was a submarine going with secret cargo that might enable the Japanese to extend the duration of the Pacific War, taking valuable German technology, materials and research to Japan. Ventura is on a mission to destroy U-864. So, I would add, are packs of Black Swan class sloops, some Flower class corvettes and Castle class corvettes, and even a couple of Hunt class escort destroyers are out there hunting for it. There are also long-range patrol aircraft, and I think there's even a cruiser not that far away, just in case anything nastier turns out to be there. Anyway, the hydrophone operator aboard Ventura noticed a strange sound, which he couldn't identify. He thought it sounded like a diesel engine. Lieutenant Launders, his commanding officer, decided to track the strange noise. Then the officer of the watch on Ventura's periscope noticed another periscope above the surface of the water. Probably, more likely, it was the U-boat's snorkel. But there is a debate as to how much British submarine crews knew of snorkel systems. I think they probably knew more than is often perceived. It's often reviewed as they won't know unless they've had an official briefing. But in my experience, when it comes to enemy technology, which could be good gossip, that will get around most armed forces very quickly. So you might well have initially identified it as periscope, as that was something he was more used to seeing, but I think they would have known about snorkels and might have quickly decided it was that. The snorkel limited the U-boat's speed and depth, which provides some very interesting points of bearing. This, combined with the reports of strange noise, allowed Launders to work out he'd found a U-864. Tracking the course, hoping she would surface and allow for a clear shot. But she remained at snorkel depth, which was safer because, again, what I've said, if submarines are below the surface, it makes them harder to see, and that's their entire survivability. That's their entire ace, that they are below the surface. Now, Launders had to decide on whether to attack before his batteries lost their charge or not, and he decided to go with the theoretical possibility of computing a fire exit solution, of working out the time, distance, bearing, and target depth, using mainly their own mental calculations. Yes, they have some systems aboard which are designed to help, but none had really been designed to deal with a vessel which was underwater. In fact, in most torpedo attacks, the target's angle relative to the attacker is easily observed because, of course, the target can be seen. And then a rangefinder in the periscope is used to establish the distance to the target. And from this, speed can be derived, and a basic mechanical computer would offset the aiming point of the torpedo, the depth of which was set based on target identification. i.e., you have to work out how deep a hull you're likely dealing with, because you don't want the torpedo to pass underneath, and you don't want to go too shallow, in the case of a submarine, because it could pass over above. Although I think if you're probably HMS Ventura, you're quite happy if it passes over you, just as long as it doesn't pass over the submarine you're aiming for. And U-864 is, unfortunately, dealing with a load of people who are actually very good at maths. Launders made the calculations. A couple of other officers aboard also made attempts at the calculations. They checked them, cross-checked them, and they made some assumptions about what U-864 might do as defensive maneuvers, and then fired all 4 of his bow torpedo tubes and dived immediately to avoid retaliation by a U-864. Torpedoes were fired at a 17.5 second delay between each pair and at different depths. Now, U-864 did attempt to evade when it heard torpedoes coming, But because of the snorkel, because of the noisy damaged engine, it would presume, and the time it took to retract the snorkel, disengage the diesel, start the electric motions, she had issues. And still though, she did very well. She dodged 1, she dodged 2, she dodged 3 torpedoes. But those very dodges showed luck, judgment, skill, whatever you want to say, on the part of Launders and his team. And she steered, U-864 steered directly into the path of the 4th torpedo. Split in 2 and sank with all hands. To this day, it's the only acknowledged engagement below the waves. Mediterranean theatre. Well, this is always fun. You get lots of very interesting, very cool boats in this. You get 10th Flotilla, the U-class, and other vessels that fought from Malta. And made Malta a very dangerous place to go if you were enemy ships aiming around that area. But you also have these boats. Now, interestingly enough, if you look at your model submarines, there is a good chance that your model submarines, which you've always seen marketed as U-boats and things, if you look at them, actually look more like a Fluto than they do a German U-boat. There is a reason for that. One of the original companies which made toy submarines after World War II was Italian. Fluto class weren't well known around the world, so they rebranded. And it became one of the standard sort of basis of the models which went around. And I've known this for a few years because I looked at a toy U-boat I was given as a kid by an uncle who had gone travelling in that part of the world and went, "That's not a U-boat." My uncle went, "Yes it is, it's labelled as a U-boat." My dad went, "Considering how geeky he is over submarines, I'm not sure if it... I'd suggest we check." Showed him photos of U-boats, of Type 7s, of Type 9s. Then I showed him a photo of a Fluto, or of the plan of Fluto. And they went, "Oh, you're right. Losses in the Mediterranean theatre? For the Allies, 76 warships and 48 submarines. For the Axis, 83 warships from Italy alone, 84 submarines from Italy alone, 2,018,616 tons of merchant shipping. $2 million, that is. Now, if you think about the Battle of Atlantic, if we consider that's 3,500 merchant vessels lost. We can think about that in terms of tonnage. 21,000 Royal Italian Navy personnel killed, and roughly 6,500 merchant navy personnel killed. Germany also lost 17 warships and 68 more submarines, and Vichy France lost 11 warships and 7 submarines. Mediterranean was always a difficult theatre for submarines. It's shallow waters. And there's a reason why the U-boats of the Royal Navy do well. They're small, they're thin, they're rapier-like in intent and design. It's the same with the smaller Italian boats. They're big coastal boats, they're big Atlantic, oceanic boats. They're the ones which they get into trouble. But they're coastal boats. They do well. And those really take on the bulk of the successful actions. But the Mediterranean was not an easy theatre. Not for submarines, and not for anyone really, because it's a scenario where things can rapidly get worse. Everywhere is close enough together, there is no breathing time. One of the interesting things, again, when you start discussing convoy battles, and the big convoy battles in World War II, in the Mediterranean especially, they're huge operations. You realise that those are convoy operations fought in the face of submarine, constant land-based air attack, and surface fleet actions. And that both sides have submarines taking part in it. The Allied submarines are trying to intercept enemy convoys, as well as provide warning, if not interception, of enemy surface action groups heading your way. Their submarines are trying to do the same to your convoy force. You've got aircraft out hunting, and submarines out hunting. And if a submarine can't engage you, well, they send off a message. Why? Because unlike in the Mid-Atlantic, if they send off a message, then help is hours and hours away, tens of hours away. There's no aircraft going to be with them anytime soon. You send off the message and they're right past of the Mediterranean, especially if the convoy is, let's say, hugging the north coast of Africa to try and keep away from the absolute maelstrom of air bases up on the northern shores of the Mediterranean. And they happen to be just close to some of the bases on the southern shores of the Mediterranean, North African bases. You can have an air attack there in 20 minutes. What do you do as a destroyer? You know there's an enemy submarine out there. Do you go and hunt it down to try and get revenge? But then that's going to leave the convoy with a destroyer, one destroyer less to protect against air attack. But you also know that that submarine might use the air attack as cover for getting closer. There is always the possibility of a 2-1 punch. Always a possibility. Then we need an ocean theatre. This gets so much forgotten. Okay, for starters, the Leonardo da Vinci, the most successful Italian submarine of World War II, primarily operates in the Western Indian Ocean, operating there out from European bases at long range. It was operating from European bases, going all the way down the Atlantic into the Indian Ocean. Why? Because it was worthwhile. Because instead of the Indian Ocean being a safe space, and if you think again about the Royal Navy's pre-World War II plans, think about them. They're sealed an Italian fleet off in the Mediterranean. Then you only have to convoy in the Med. Seal the Germans off in the North Sea. Then you only have to convoy in the North Atlantic. Don't let them into Norway or anything like that. Well, they're not really supposed to invade Norway. No one's supposed to think about invading Norway. Or knocking the French out of the war. And for Japanese, seal them off. First to Singapore, then push north. Why? Because you want to have areas where you don't have to convoy. It saves a huge amount on resources. And makes those areas far more economically efficient. But you have things like the Monsoon Gruppe, based at Penang. where you have German, Italian, and Japanese submarines operating alongside each other. Which causes a nightmare for the Japanese for another reason, because it means you're not allowed to engage submarines. You're not allowed to really carry out anti-submarine warfare for fear of taking out an allied submarine. And trust me, the British subs were prepared to take full advantage of that particular freedom. It's great. You're not allowed to attack me because I could be German. Happiness. I can do what I like. The Indian Ocean Theatre is absolutely and completely nuts. And it's one of the least covered theatres when it comes to naval warfare and when it comes to submarine warfare. Because again, there is an easy narrative when it comes to Battle Atlantic. The narrative isn't always correct, because it picks up themes which come straight out of the First World War's Battle Atlantic narrative and doesn't let them drop, when in fact it's a very different war. But it is capable. Then we have the Pacific Theatre. Oh, and yeah. Key part I forgot to mention about the Indian Ocean. One of the things that's often forgotten here is that the burden it puts on ships, but not just on the ships, but you can have an outsized impact here. Because if you think about it, if you're operating in the Western Indian Ocean, you're dealing with the convoys which have gone round Africa, coming up the Indian Ocean to go into Suez from the back and support North African campaign from the back, or heading towards India, or maybe ones which have gone towards Singapore and reinforced there. You've got a lot of convoys which therefore will probably think, and quite a lot of their crew will probably think, they're on their home straits. They might not therefore be as alert. They might not be as watching. And that might give you an advantage. Just as it gave quite a lot of surface raiders in World War II. And you have lists of vessels getting sunk. U-181 sinks managed to get quite a lot of ships, but there is things like the I-27 sinking the freighter Fort Mumford off India. U-551 sank Liberty ship Sebastian Sermo south of Madagascar. I-37 sank the Liberty ship Henry Knox. And these are all just from June 1943. If we're looking at March, well, 80 years ago today, the 8th of March, U-160 sank the Liberty ship James B. Stevens east of South Africa. There are a lot of submarine operations in the Indian Ocean during World War II. The British would have loved to have more submarines there. The Dutch did manage to do stuff with their submarines there, but the British fought things like Operation Sea, etc. If they had more subs there, if they had more subs that were available, they could have turned Operation Sea into a very nasty experience for the Japanese. And then you get into the whole wider Pacific Theatre doctrine. You have a very interesting scenario where you have I honestly have no idea to really describe it, but So, the Americans pursue their submarines an offensive defense. They're pushing forward. They're pushing forward hard to take out things like merchant ships and the vessels which are keeping the arteries of the Japanese war industry going. And they're doing this to slow down the offensive, if not cripple the offensive, to enable the Americans in the Pacific theatre, etc., to buy time until then the fleet which has been ordered can be available and they can come in and go romping stomping to victory. But the Japanese are the ones who start a war, but I've put an ambush offense there. They're expecting they starting the attacks, and they're expecting to goad the Americans into attacking them, and then using their submarines to weed them down. And the Japanese did actually have some submarines which were long enough range to reach the west coast of America, to reach the Pacific coast. And they did. As I've discussed in this channel, at some points they turn up and they shoot it with guns. But they have a particular problem. They never have enough. And they don't have enough logistics to support them. Even when they do capture spaces which might be suitable forward bases, they don't really supply them and don't have the means to supply them with the necessary support. Whereas the Americans certainly have the means, desire, and inclination to produce oodles and oodles of Gato-class submarines and just keep churning them out. It worked. They were a reliable design, and they worked. They were viable. But still, there is one submarine above all others which has to be remembered. And it's probably one of the more interesting submarines of World War II in its service record, because its service record starts off with being laid down by Italy in April 1938, launched in May 1939, and commissioned in September 1939. Now, it was originally commissioned as Comandante Capielli. Then in May 1943, it was renamed Aquila No. 3. It was captured by Japan on 10th September 1943 and handed over to Germany, who renamed it UI-24 and acquired it September 1943 and commissioned December 1943, and then surrendered it to the Japanese on 10th of May 1945 when it was operated by a mixed Italian-German crew. It sunk 5 merchant vessels as the Italian vessel Comandante Capielli. As UIT-4, it served as part of the 12th and 33rd of U-boat flotillas. It did 6 operational patrols. It sank no ships. As part of the Japanese Navy, it was acquired on 10th May 1945, commissioned on the 14th July 1945, and captured by the US Navy in August 1945. Sculled on the 6th of April 1946. By this point, it had a mixed Italian, German, and Japanese crew. And again, she achieved no victories. Vessels it sunk included the Capello of Belgium, the Shakespeare and Eumenius, fancy Greek name of the UK, the Tisnan of Sweden, and the RAF Dinsdale, which was actually probably the most annoying vessel for it to sink, because Dinsdale was actually something useful. Sad times when Dinsdale gets sunk. There you go. Serves all three of the major Axis navies in World War Two. Didn't do that greatly for two of them, but served all three. But submarines don't stop after World War Two until nuclear boats become available. In fact, what happens after World War Two is there is a bit of a pause, and then usually the last classes which are being built at the end of World War Two are completed off, and they provide the core of the boats going into the 40s and 50s. For example, the A-class. These are some great boats, and if you go to Gosport, you will find one last surviving example of them. And they become the prototype for what I would call the Commonwealth post-World War II diesel boat. In that they have all these technologies and systems built into them. They're as modern as they can be made at the end of World War II. And whilst, yes, as I said, they're modernised in the 50s, those upgrades are more about keeping their systems relevant than adding in new capabilities, in terms of it's an expansion of the existing systems to continue to provide capabilities at the requisite level for them to be operationally viable. Or put another way, it's giving it the ability to launch more advanced, more capable torpedoes, to do especially things that are developed for submarine to submarine warfare. That little action by Ventura has a long consequence, because it's kind of like the first time someone took up a gun in a plane and started shooting at the other plane in World War I and went bang, bang, bang in my pistol. Once someone's done that, you start to think, well, hang on, there's got to be a better way of doing this. And once Ventura had sunk U-864, there are now lots of people going, okay, so she fired 4 torpedoes, 1 hit. That's a bit of a fluke. And there are already homing torpedoes and things being developed, which had been themselves having an effect on submarine operations, but now also open up new avenues for submarines themselves. And then we get to the 1950s. And, well, 1950s, you have nuclear-powered submarines, which, one of the interesting things about nuclear-powered submarines, this is one of those interesting scenarios that comes in. The Americans have been talking about it since early 1930s. The British are the ones who launch the first program into it. The program actually begins in 1939. And it's one of those great what-ifs, because if World War II doesn't start in 1939, but started in 1942, when the British were predicting, based on the end of the 10-year rule, that's where the Royal Navy had to be prepared for. The Royal Navy 10-year rule was officially ended in 1932, unofficially still in existence till 1937, but the Royal Navy therefore was banking on war roughly 1942 to 45. Well, considering the amount of money the Royal Navy is putting into research in those years, and can afford to in a peacetime economy, and considering the efforts being put for it, there is the very real possibility that nuclear submarines could have taken part in World War II if it had been delayed till 1945. Yes, a lot of technology is developed during wartime, but there's a lot more which could have been developed in peacetime if time had been allowed. Because most of the bomb work had started even earlier. Again, the thing is, the Manhattan Project is the fusing of the British and American efforts to develop a nuclear weapon. And most of those efforts have been going for quite a while. And it's difficult sometimes to explain because people go, well, are they building fuges? Are they building all the systems they need? And you go, yeah, on an experimental level, but you have to remember there's a lot of incremental steps and foundations which have to be put into place before you can get there. How do I explain it? There is a game which is quite popular, and I do have a version of it because a lot of my engineering students are obsessed with it, called Timberborn, which is about beavers, and you basically are building a colony with beavers. Anyway, let's say I want to build a water reservoir. Okay? Standard thing. I need, to build that, I need some steel to give it a strong base. I need timber, planks, not logs, and I need cogs. Okay. That means, first of all, I have to know how, I have to develop an idea of how to assemble it, but even when I have the idea to assemble it, I need to have all the industries in place to build those, and all the ideas for them. So I have to have a logging industry that is getting me wood. And I have to have the timber industry that is turning logs into planks. And I have to have the cog industry that turns planks into cogs. I have to have the smelting thing that turns the scrap iron into iron blocks that I can use. And I have to have the builders who can build it all, and they need to know what they're building. So I need to have probably built the smaller version of the reservoir before I can build the large one of the reservoir, so I can earn the research points and have done the analysis to do it. In other words, the projects we see in World War II which come to fruition are not these short-term amazing things. That is the short-term amazing pinnacle of the mountain, but that sits on a huge base, a huge expansive base of other industries and other developments which have been going on for centuries, decades if not centuries, to be developed. And you also have USS Tunney, which has these newfangled surface-to-surface missile systems. Or rockets, really, let's be honest. They're basically vaguely upgraded V2 style systems. But again, that's a new thing you have to deal with from fighting a submarine perspective. You've got a submarine which is, whose purpose is not to come out and attack other submarines or to attack enemy ships, but it's to sneak as close to your shore as it can do, to launch a missile that will hit a target and hopefully get to it so quickly your own air defences won't be able to respond, because it'll be launched from within your air defence perimeter, which presumably by this point expands across the sea. Ouch. 1960s, SSBNs arrived. Well, you have the George Washington class at the top. But also SSBKs. Yes, diesel-powered ballistic missile submarines are not something new that North Korea has developed. Nope, the Gulf Project 629 class were around a long time beforehand. And again, this gives the submarines a strategic element, but it's something which actually plays into their traditional advantage. as we talked about earlier, their traditional advantage has always been towards being stealth tools. Hiding, not at fighting. They're ambush predators. The moment they can't ambush you, they're in trouble. The moment they reveal they're a predator, they're in trouble. It's always a balance between hunter and prey when you're a submarine. Because yes, you can attack, and maybe they don't know you're there, but the moment you attack, they're going to know you're there, and they're going to have a bearing on you. And that means they're going to start hunting you. And again, we've got to stop thinking in terms of the single ship highlight events which come up in history, and we could talk about them and go, oh, look how this ship was destroyed by this. Those are rare. So more often is you see task group versus task group, and you have to think about how those things interact. But these vessels are individual ships. They sail out alone very specifically. They hide alone very specifically. So that they make them truly needles in a haystack. Or, more realistically, little bits of foil in a stack of needles. There's somewhere in there, but goodness knows where. All to preserve the security of the strategic payload they carry. The range and the firepower of that, which was one of the most horrifically powerful weapon systems ever fielded. And they preserve peace. We don't like how you do it, and let's be honest. If even the people who support what you're doing refer to it as mutually assured destruction or mad, then no one likes how it's done. It's just, at its base point, it's both sides are pointing a gun at each other's heads and going, you flinch? You look like you're going to shoot? We shoot first. Or, you flinch and shoot me, I will shoot you before that bullet hits and you will both be dead. It's terrible. But it's also effective as a realistic form of deterrence. Because it doesn't rely on either side having any faith in the other side's words, only both sides presuming upon the other's desire for self-preservation, which gives them actually, funnily, a basis of trust. But it's also an era of the Hughes Glomar Explorer. Why? Because quite a lot of submarines end up going down. It's one of the problems in the 1960s. You've got a lot of new technologies being developed, a lot of very interesting technologies being developed, but vessels such as the K-129, the K-8, the K-219, and the Commercells, along with the Thresher and the Scorpion, all go down. There are lots of interesting stuff on the floor of the seabed, which intelligence agencies and navies are really interested in. (1970s). One of the interesting things about the Cold War is it forces people into a bit of a pattern. But that also means that some of the most interesting and learnable from conflicts do not take place in the primary theatre of the contesting powers. No! Things like this happen. In the 1970s, a Tench-class SSK, the PNS Gazelle, is sunk, probably by the INS Rajput. Now, here is this interesting thing. Clarke gets sunk by the Hangar, Pakistan Navy. But the Rajput, which is at the top, which is a World War II R-class destroyer, sinks probably the Tench. Now the thing is, why is it said probably? Because there have been various other ideas put forward for how and why she was sunk. Engine failure, just randomly sinking, all sorts of things. And that's a problem, because it does muddy the waters. With a ship, when it sinks, you can quite clearly see why she sinks. With a submarine, unless you go hunting and manage to find the wreck, and even then, you can't always be 100% sure. But I still think it's fair to put claimed. Because both sides are fairly decent on the anti-submarine warfare scale at that point. Both sides found their submarines, broadly speaking, successful. But the fact is, there was nothing really new going on in this decade. Everything was a continuation of what had happened in other decades. Even this, you can sit there and argue, SSKs fighting vessels from World War II, vessels which were mostly upgraded vessels from World War II against mostly upgraded World War II era designs. But don't worry. Towards the end of the 1970s and massively in the 1980s, we have the Los Angeles class come into service. And they are a new standard in capability. What's more is, they are a very viable standard in terms of capability. They give the US Navy a huge capability boost compared to their predecessors. Why were they so special? Why was the Los Angeles class so really important? Because in many ways, they represent the point at which nuclear submarines come of age. They become really viable attack submarines. It's at this point you start producing a class in large enough numbers, with enough capability, enough viability, that you can actually use them for all the jobs. That you are not producing little itty-bitty groups of ships, you are actually producing a huge class which can take on all the roles. That's a massive thing. And I think this is the point at which where a lot of interesting history and historical analysis starts to come about, because when you're looking at the submarine capabilities in the late Cold War and you're writing about the future, you're writing about warfare and the risk of warfare at the time, it must be so tempting to look back at history and go, well, look at this amazing capability we have as submarines that we are justifying to our politicians to invest oodles and oodles of money in. Surely it must have always been obvious this was where they were going to come about. This is where submarines were going to reach. And yet, when you think about it, if you go back from a Los Angeles class all the way back. All the way back. It's been a long time coming. It's been a long, long time coming. But there is also another problem with the Los Angeles class. They're a bit of a hump, really. Because they're when you're making a class to do everything. To be good as it can be at everything. Trying to limit the number of compromises. Trying to limit the inefficiencies of your design so they're as capable as they possibly can be. Which is nice, it's what you want them to be, but you have a problem. if you do that, you're going to ultimately make them all very expensive. And then this comes along. Falklands War. Again, the British out to get the kills, or rather, it always seems tasteless, but it's the first in naval warfare. Not just the first SSN to sink a vessel, an enemy vessel in war, but also they sank a cruiser. And they sank a World War II era cruiser with World War II era torpedoes. Which, thanks to some persistent logistics, could fit in the same tubes. Falklands War has an impact. Think about it, the previous war to this that had actually had submarines taking armed shots at each other and at the opponent had been the Pakistan-India War of 1971, or India-Pakistan War of 1971. But those have been using systems which were mostly enhanced versions of World War II era systems. This is a nuclear submarine. The scenario which happened to HMS Swifter and losing the carrier is studied over and over again. The sinking of the Belgrano is done over and over again. The role of Conqueror, its capabilities, and the fact that after this operation, they go off to do some Cold War work, and that is often the Cold War mission which takes place after the Falklands War is often described by the crew as the most important mission they ever did. And I won't discuss and tell you what that mission was, but that's something. Suddenly you are back in the ship killing game again. And for the Royal Navy that's essential because, and becomes a bit of a problem for the Royal Navy you can argue, because there is perception that the Royal Navy's SSNs can always do the job. And they're relied upon to almost exclusively to do so. If we consider the long time it's taken to get a replacement for Harpoon, and you can argue the fact that Exocet was allowed to leave without a replacement, and that we for many years didn't really have the best strike capabilities for anti-ship operations with our aircraft. It has been our submarines for years which are relied on since the Falklands War for the anti-ship work. Which is respectable, but brings you back to the same problem. At what point is it A, justifiable for a submarine to A, reveal its position, and B, fire one of the very expensive weapons it has aboard? Because now you no longer have guns, and you definitely don't want a nuclear submarine surfacing to engage in a gunfight. You only have torpedoes. Yes, they're more powerful, but you also carry a lot fewer of them. A lot fewer. And your submarine is bigger and more powerful and more expensive and all sorts of things as well. Then we see this idea goes into the 90s. And what are the USN developing? The Seawolf class. Possibly the best submarines ever developed. Potentially. The best hunter-killer submarines ever developed. It's an argument. But they lose out because they are so niche. They are so focused in on that killing any enemy submarine jobs and intelligence gathering roles that when the Cold War is over, why do we need to spend that much money on them? They suffer the same fate as the F-22 because rather like the F-22 and the F-14, and sadly enough the A-6 and A-6 as well, they are deemed not necessary for operations. After all, from that point onwards, with the Cold War over, it was always going to be permissive environments. It was always going to be wars of choice. So why do you need these things? This is a peer-on-peer level system. You have no peer though in the 1990s. Why spend the money? Why operate such a system when you have no peer? So, 20th century? Was it the Submarine Century? No. You can possibly argue it's the Aviation Century. You can probably argue it was the Aviation Century. But not the Submarine Century. What about the 21st century? Will that be the Submarine Century? You see, I don't think so. I think there is a permanent problem the submarine has to deal with for it to be the Submarine Century. They have a strong narrative about their capabilities, but once you start looking at the facts, they also have a history of suffering. Even Conqueror. She sinks Belgrano. She doesn't sink its escorts, she just sinks Belgrano. And then she dodges. She has to. Because she's not supposed to be sinking the escorts. Even though they're just as a threat in their own way as Belgrano was. And so she's got to dodge them instead of sink them. Rules of engagement. It's a factor. If you're not going to allow for unrestricted submarine warfare, they're going to have to spend a lot of time dodging. And that ultimately comes down to the great strength and the great weakness of a submarine. If you want to make it viable for hiding, if you want to make it viable enough it can hide, you have to make compromises in making it lethal. Or as lethal as you want it to be. Or maybe as fast as you want it to be. Because again, escorts are improving. Surface, land-based aircraft, helicopters, they're factors. UAVs, or UCVs if you want to call them. USVs, uncrewed submersible vehicles, are going to be a factor in making the life for a submarine more and more complicated. And the thing is, those submarines, to operate at the ranges they do, for the times they do need the squidgy organic bits in them. A fair number. And that starts to place an impact on your submarine. I think submarines are a key system. Just because I'm saying it's not the century of the submarine doesn't mean I don't think it's a valuable system. I just think the trouble is the last century, the 20th century, could have been the submarine century if it hadn't been for the rise of aircraft. And I think the 21st century won't be the submarine century because my prediction is that it's going to be satellite-based information gathering systems which are going to have a massive impact on it all. Because the moment you can start looking at the ocean and go, the current doesn't seem to be behaving right here and here in real time. we've got a map of this ocean. We've got this computer model which tells us what the ocean should be doing, and this is flagging up anomalies where it's not behaving like it should be doing. Go and investigate. You've got a very big problem as a submarine commander. You have a very big problem at that point. And I think at that point you do have to become more as part of the task group, i.e. we can't investigate those areas because they're quite close to the enemy task group. Which, in many ways, takes us back to the Hunley and the early forms of blockade. Because if your enemy's going to know you're coming, you might as well turn up with enough force from the get-go to make sure you get there. If you can't, perhaps you need to think of a different strategy. Indirect blockade, perhaps. Alright then, I haven't updated this slide, but I know what we've got on Thursday. We have got the alternative history with the Green Boys at Jutland, i.e. the artillery shells. And that's quite an easy one to work out, really, and make happen. And what we've got next week, we have Grand Strategy, when the world is really not enough. Ah, yeah, that's going to be a fun one. A lot less technical than this one, and not covering as much ground. It's going to be a far shorter one, but it's a introduction to strategic thinking, basically. And strategical thinking. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I'm going to, as always, finish with a question. Question is this. Where do you see the future of submarines going? Where do you see the future of submarines? I hope you enjoyed. Thank you for watching. Take care.